Okay. Recording started. Welcome everybody. Welcome Eric. We have a few people down today, but hopefully they'll return on the next one. As I mentioned earlier, we probably are going to miss maybe one or two as we approach the holidays. We'll figure that out. But just to get things going, last time we talked about the big net of trust and how trust figures into cross-organizational collaboration, how it figures into just about everything we do when we interact. So what I recall from the last conversations is that we talked about very explicit trust, through close relationships, all the way to proxies for trust in social media. I guess, and there's another topic that as an extension of proxies to trust, which is I think beyond trust, there's also this idea of greed. Honestly, sometimes you see that in cryptocurrency, people trust others because they want to improve their own position in something. And is that not a factor in collaboration as well, especially in business? So it's not a pretty topic to talk about, but how does trust/greed factor into collaboration as well? And I don't necessarily use that as a negative term, although it could be. But anyway, I will stop talking because this may go somewhere I don't want it to. But I thought it was worth mentioning.
I have some initial thoughts. So I think the question is like incentive, right, or reason, like why. Trust is a decision. And so like, what is the causal chain? And greed, as you say, could be a piece of that, but there's also probably others. I think we could probably have like quite an abstract conversation, but I'm actually really curious. Noticing Eric has joined. In the last call, Eric mentioned specifically the trustworthiness of the data that they're trying to produce is the question. So maybe we could have a dialogue around that as like a sort of a boundary object to think through.
Sure. I can probably give some ideas on this. I don't think I have the perfect answer, by the way. But ultimately, there's two things that gauge trust. One is, hate to say it, but the cost of the actual data suggests it's not necessarily accurate all the time, but it does suggest a level of due diligence. So I'll give you an example. Open data on the internet is less trustworthy than something I get from Standard & Poor's, S&P, for example. And S&P may be better than, there's an open source corporate hierarchy, for example, Glyph, it's called. It's open source and it's available, but there's an organization that curates it. But S&P is better than Glyph, which is free. It's a volunteer organization that puts it together, but it's pretty darn good, which is better than, abstract data. So I think cost is one of them. The other thing I've seen is there's various different ways of providing feedback on trust. So I'll give you a few examples. On GitHub, we call them stars, right? You star or you watch or you fork a project. That is an indicator of, it's a source of validity, I suppose, and hence trust. So there's social aspects also that we anticipate within the climate group, I think, over time to see how we can add that level. Because I'm part of what we're trying to do is we're trying to be that DNS for climate data. Where does it all exist? And at some point in time, I'm sure somebody will be able to commercialize it, but it's really meant to be a free resource. So cost is not a way we can generate trust, but I think having people, so-called star or provide positive feedback, thumbs up or whatever, likes, is one method of gauging trust that we think is practical. So those are the two that come to mind for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what you touch upon here is a lot of this peer factor in that someone else also. It doesn't have to be someone that is actually known to the person that wants to trust, but it needs to be someone that is more or less verified by the system itself to be trusting. The question here is about the validation of data that could be done by others. For instance, in climate data, can this be independently validated? So here's how academia works in general, someone else also says that this is good, then it's better than it was before. And it's replicable. So these kind of trust factors probably come in.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I would add on to that. So, I mean, we're used to looking at a really sort of basic framework for trust, right? The 5-star review, you know, Airbnb and Amazon and eBay and GitHub, they all use that, and they can, because basically it's a consumer decision, right? Did you like this thing? Are you using the code? Is it good? That is not the same problem with the same trust concern with this domain. The concern here is this data representative of real, you know, context on the ground? And that's such a complex technical answer. And to be, you know, quite frank, from the research that I've done, most of this data is not, right. It's, you know, it's either it's not grounded, especially the analyses that, you know, use the data, or it's focused on such a small frame that it's really difficult to, you know, the problems that we see. So I think getting to Philippe's, you know, question, right, like how does it become a reputable verification is really the crucial piece for this, especially as we just saw, you know, BlackRock unrolled its ESG fund, right, because it's not probably at all verifiable, or, you know, any of those things.
Yeah,
I
so
think
these are
with
some-
data, yeah, go on. With data, as data can represent everything, the trust question is a very tricky one. And I would agree that when we are talking about cross-organization, the pattern we may have is there are data producers and data consumers. So when we exchange data, we consume data, and you can trust the producer itself. I don't know, maybe S&P, okay, as mentioned. And I think this is mandatory, especially for streaming data, because the way you consume data may be totally different if it's you want to subscribe for data in the future, okay? And then the trust, you don't know the data in advance. The indicators you can be sure, and so there is an intrinsic uncertainty about the future data. So when you will subscribe to this, your trust will maybe come either afterwards, or maybe with the producer or some indicators, okay, you will have. And for historic data, then you can have verified data, okay, because you are after the events, let's say, or the data was computed, or the product was released, and then maybe somebody external can say, okay, I verified this using doing this and that, and this is a good data quality. Okay, so the data quality is also at the core of trust, but data quality by itself, I think, is really open and very different according to if it's streaming, if it's historic data, and in which domain you are.
So
That's
if
Go ahead. I was just going to say that's a great
Yeah.
distinction. Yeah.
Because what I take that to it, in what I hear, and I'm trying to translate it, is basically an open source data verification pipeline that is available. This is how it happened. This is how the verification could be done. And when that is open, that means that anyone can introspect and have comments and say that it could be done in a different way, and also have trust in that pipeline of ensuring the verification happens in a straightforward way.
What's interesting is that where this happens currently, you know, mostly, at least for ESG and sustainability type data, is in peer review articles, but it's not actually in the journals that we're having this sort of validation discussion. That's happening in conferences, right? It's manual exchange between the experts. So when we think about ESG data, I mean, our approach, Eric, is basically we want to somehow figure out how to extract NLP from the massive number of publications that come out of international development and environmental science and so on, where all of the information about geographical conditions is actually present, but it's not translated into a business audience yet. So the question almost is, how do we construct a pipeline that enables that knowledge to be extracted, but in such a way that it's also sort of opening up this communal validation, discussion, interpretation, analysis layer on top of that as well. So it's truly, you know, a data supply chain of multiple sort of functionalities related to that data.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I would agree. I think there's a few things that I heard. Well, obviously independent validation. Somebody actually says it's accurate. I think there's also subtle nuance that there's independent verification. Does the pipeline, is the pipeline suitable so that if it's trusted over here, the input's trusted, that the output will be trusted despite the transformations that it occurs. I think there's also, so for example, I think Ellie, you're at NASA or with NASA or something like that, if I recall?
I'm consulting with NASA, but I'm actually running Common Action, which is a climate change knowledge graph software, you know, sort of
Okay.
solution. Yeah.
Perfect. So the other one is just using NASA as an example. People trust NASA because it has a proven track record of being trusted. And in other words, the other, you know, the proven track record is important, but I think also the fact that we give certain data, the organization that creates it is a proxy for trust. So if I trust NASA, I trust the data that it actually creates. So that there's a chain of trust almost that occurs along the way. That if that chain is strong, and there's few gaps or breaks in the link, then I think the organization that creates it may be also a proxy for trust.
Yeah, I think there's that's sort of the historical standard. And I think that in this domain, it can be quite problematic because the domain itself is so understudied and sort of undefined that I mean, of course, you know, NASA's data collection is gold standard, but is the interpretation, is the way that you know, information and that data combined to produce an analysis by somebody else potentially who's, you know, not at NASA. I mean, there's so many layers of this of the aggregation of these data into some analysis that any step of this process could go wrong, right? And so I think that the most important steps that do go wrong that are not well documented currently are in the initial interpretation of events happening on the ground and sort of, you know, what are the factors that influence whatever the signal is. Those are typically studied within, you know, a siloed context. However, life as we know it is quite complicated. So, you know, if we do not have the skills at this moment to kind of capture and create the narratives at the source of the data, then, you know, it doesn't matter how trustworthy the brand is, right? Like this is actually a paradigm shifting moment where our previous tools are not exactly prepared for addressing this. So, and this is not like a simple problem, but one really great exemplar of it is there was a paper that came out of MIT, I think a few years ago, and they basically, you know, did this analysis of all the ESG metrics to try to figure out, you know, how to make them comparable to each other. And I think they came up with, I'm confusing too. There was also one at Harvard that tried to make like a representation for environmental damage, like economically. But in any case, the MIT folks, they published some analysis. They realized that the metrics were just, you know, really the standard deviation had no statistical meaning. And they then like started to look into the data, right? And so now at MIT, they're running sort of an exploration to discuss the ESG data because they realized that the data that they were using, or that the ESG metrics were using that were producing such bad results, was actually itself specious, right? And so like what's not clear for folks that are sort of more domain experts is that data can be such an immense wreck and such an uncertain space. And, you know, there's I mean, there's like a whole lot of conflicting sort of like blind spots in this particular domain.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question, the question a different way. Is there an analog or an example of where data there is a process by which you trust the data. So one example that comes to mind, for example, is health data. So when I take a Tylenol or or whatever drug it happens to be, I trust that for a variety of different reasons, not just because it comes from a well-known company, but that there's a whole process, clinical trials. I don't know much about healthcare, to be honest with you, or drug pharma, but there's little that I know, there's a very very detailed and rigorous process that is validated time and time again. Is there, like, I don't know if it's a good analogy, but is there an analog where we see something actually working in the industry that we can leverage, or at least like map to?
I think that, yeah, sorry, I know I'm just like jumping in, but I will stop talking after this. But I think healthcare is really the right analogy and metric or certification standard to go for, because if we think about it, the environments and the state of environmental deterioration is really similar to a health problem. It's just the body of the earth, which is bigger than the human body. The problem is that this is sort of a new domain. It's quite a serious time for the level of disease, but we haven't invested in all of the things that healthcare has, right? The learnings and the research and so on and so on. And so what's missing is that fundamental structure of like the entire industry, which knows how to check and balance itself to produce reliable, trustworthy, statements like Tylenol is okay for you to take. You should take it if you're in pain. These things, these basic things. And so, sort of like, how do we build that level of sophistication extremely rapidly?
I think Eric, your mention of pharma and healthcare, I would see them as a bit two different things, two different sides of that coin. But we have extremely rigorous processes of compliance. And it all comes back to observations that are very rigidly checked. Bringing that level to climate will probably be quite expensive and quite hard. And so I'm thinking it took the healthcare industry and pharma 100 years to get right, more or less, to get all of these processes in place. And the timescale of 100 years in the future, that we don't want to think that question in this space. But also we need some kind of verification. And when I'm thinking of compliance, it's a lot of work to get compliance right, but still we want accurate data. And how do we get accurate data that is trustworthy without having the compliance? So it's really to understand the other side of it. How important is it to get it right? And how bad is it if we get it wrong? I can draw from my experience in cybersecurity. You cannot have perfect cybersecurity in any company because that is too expensive. You need to find the right level based on the risks. And then going back to find the risks, you need to find the right way to think about risk, what could actually happen, and have some good ideas about that and estimating that. And getting those estimations right is not guesswork. It is to have people that understands how to make estimations. So you need to calibrate the subjects. And this is a whole area in statistics where you can actually prove that you have calibrated subjects that can make experiments, but getting that at scale for all of this, I don't know how we would do that in a proper way. But I think that some part of this is actually to be able to make the necessary estimations, not guesswork, real proper estimations like you're doing in quantitative risk management, where you can put correct estimations, a confidence interval of something that is good enough, where you have pre-validate the subjects, that the academia is there telling this is a sound process to use. And perhaps that is a way to find a proxy for what we need to look at. Maybe not look at the exact numbers, but have subject matter experts that know it well enough to be able to say something.
Yeah, like in the climate domain, ultimately the folks that are driving this, it's not necessarily the right approach, but it's a very compelling one nonetheless, is customers are saying, to asset managers, which are really insurers, banks, big fund companies, et cetera. And what they're saying is that we actually do care about the environment, and we do care about you investing in things that are good for the environment as opposed to bad. So what ends up happening is the power of the dollar, it is it actually motivates people much quicker, at least these big companies, much quicker than government action. Because we all know that can take a long time before any semblance of consensus actually occurs. As you can see with COP27, it's a long process at best. But so the other thing is introduce monetary incentives that force is the wrong word, that encourage people to want to participate in the right way. And I think that is the thing that's actually driving, like, the sponsors of OS Climate. Many of them are the big banks and asset managers, because they have a very particular problem, which is, people are telling us they don't want us to invest in, coal companies or whatever is an obvious example. But they're saying, we're going to punish you if you do. So this is all about, from one perspective, risk analysis. On the insurer side, they're saying, well, I don't want to invest in properties, on the Miami coast that's going to be underwater in 20 years. So there's a very practical monetary concern that is actually driving, the right behavior for a change.
Yeah, and I
So-
think you're spot on. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I can draw the analogies, because a lot of cybersecurity is about dealing with risk. So what happens there is that you have a baseline for, we're not going lower than this on security for everything, because that's simpler. It's easier to just say that you have a baseline than going into risk-based decisions for everything. Once you have the baseline in place, for the things where you have higher risks in one way or another, you go with specific measures. So maybe that is a little bit also on what we're seeing with bankers. Some things they just don't do, no matter the risk, because it is worse than trying to figure it out.
Yeah, well,
But
we
for
even
some
found
things,
like,
yeah.
like even one of the banks in Canada, RBC, the big Royal Bank of Canada, the biggest bank in Canada, one of the top 10, I think, in North America. Anyway, they got called out for, I think they call it greenwashing, but creating false expectations. I'll leave it at that, I suppose. RBC is one of my clients on a different, for my real work, not my volunteer climate work. So they actually are one of my clients, interestingly enough. But in a different group, they got called out publicly for setting incorrect expectations around their ESG profile, making false claims effectively. So I mean, bad behavior and calling it out is the other thing that does work.
So there's a new lever, right, which is, sort of blackmail, consumer blackmail, if we're being quite blunt. And it's exciting, to hear. I have a couple friends in finance too, who are sort of like, yeah, we are trained to financiers, but where are they? And I think this is, Philippe's sort of framework is exactly how we're thinking about approaching this problem. If you take the data of climate, what you're looking at is, extremely granular changes in precipitation, right? And that doesn't actually result in management level decisions like, should I fund this project or not? The project, so what we're doing at Common Action is actually creating an ontology of the material objects which are involved in climate and biodiversity challenges, because at the end of the day, that's all we have to manage. So, we're talking about farms, animals, trees, these kinds of really basic things. So, I think the answer for the section of this problem, the risk of, assets, what assets, right? What assets and what do you think about? So one of the risks that's sort of more obvious is coastal change. We're going to see water in Miami in 20 years. We know that. But there's also like a lot of sort of uncertain, more, unpredictable types of risks. And that's where you would want to take the academic data, or the academic experts, even better, right? Because they know how to interpret that data and kind of make these predictions. And, that could be something that is probably available for subscription. But on a more, one more point, I think the real challenge that the banks maybe are not even yet aware of is that there are not enough alternative investments to make, right? Like it's a very sort of underinvested industry. So even where there are people that have sort of alternative kinds of capabilities, they don't know how to get in touch with RBC.
Yeah. Well, two things. I do actually have to run for a client meeting, but one of the things that's actually quite interesting, you mentioned the word, you're developing an ontology. Interestingly enough, that is one of the core stumbling blocks that we have if you want to find the data, there's no point in looking at a forest where you see 100,000 trees. You actually have to figure out what makes an oak and what makes a maple or whatever. You need an ontology. And I know my analogy here is going to break here, but ultimately having an ontology that allows us to actually simplify the finding of the right data is actually crucial. So Ellie, I would like to reach out in that regard. One quick thing, I sent out an email a little while ago about who wanted to continue the climate dialogue. I actually have 4 folks. I have Alan, Morrison, Ellie, yourself, Andrew, yourself, and Philippe that are interested in continuing the dialogue. Olivier, obviously would love to have you on board. I didn't hear anything back from you, but I'm going to send out a Zoom invite in the very near future. I haven't heard back. Does anybody know Alan Morrison and what time zone he's in?
He's in Pacific.
Mountain,
Pacific.
Pacific.
Yeah.
Okay, so everybody is in North America, it seems. Olivier, would you be interested in participating?
Yeah. I
Okay,
would. Yeah.
Are you in Europe or
I'm in Europe. Yeah.
which time zone are you? CET.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll tell you what, I will get something that works. There's a good overlap there, so I'll get something that works for all of us here, and Alan, and I should be able to send that out later today. And maybe we can actually continue this exact dialogue because I think it's a practical one, and it's crucial in many respects for all of us. So with that, I will just have to sign off, and I will look forward to talking again soon.
Great. Looking forward. Thanks, Eric.
Bye now.
See you.
Here.
So about trust, we explored many ways. Okay, many maybe ingredients of trust. There would be the supplier of the data, if we're talking about the data, and the processing. Okay, that would be the pipeline, maybe the code. Okay, and also the data itself, for sure. Okay, the product you have when you get data or you want to consume data, and for the data itself, I think it's really the trickier way. We talked about maybe there are some cases in which you can verify the data. Okay, if it's data from sensors, and if the data is a representation of some ground truth, I don't know, the temperature in Miami, okay, you could, just looking at the data, you could have a feeling if it's good or not. Okay, so if you have a buggy sensor, you will maybe detect this, and so you will you can increase the quality of the data for this. But also, Ellie, you mentioned another kind of data which are, in my opinion, not attached to some ground truth, possibly, but predictions. Okay, if I'm predicting, I don't know, the temperature in 10 days from now in Miami, not the current one, it's not something you can verify, at least not at the moment you consume that data. In 10 days, you will be able to check that data from now, and you could have statistics. Okay, you could have indicators, and so this data quality indicators are key to this.
I would nuance that. I'm not 100% sure that I believe there's a middle ground there, but there is an important distinction between predictions and estimates. So in the realm of predictions, that is not really possible to verify more than having 2 sets of people doing the same prediction and see how well they correlate. But in terms of estimations, there are solid scientific ways of doing estimations correctly, where you have more or less subject matter expertise, where you can get a normal distribution or a log normal distribution, where you have calibrated subjects. If you go from one subject area and you make estimations and you learn to do them correctly, it's actually transferable to a different domain. So if you're doing your estimations there, you can see that they are correct. So that means that two groups that are able to do estimations about a specific thing should come to approximately the same thing. And if they do, we know we have a good estimation as well, so long as they are calibrated. So I believe that there is a way to make this trustworthy in that way. It might be a costly process, but we know that the data could be sound and accurate.
Yeah, I agree. But it's so it's not binary maybe but
Yes.
it's the whole gray area, and maybe everything is gray, okay, regarding data and in this, but yeah, sure.
Yeah.
There
But
are
what we often see-
scientific ways to estimate correctly. I would enter in my category of this is possible to check this with confidence, statistical confidence, but it is attached, I would say it is attached to some ground truth, okay, because it's a concept that also exists. Data is representing a concept that also exists in the real world. But in some cases, and when we will talk maybe about risks, about abstract things, it doesn't exist in the physical world, and then I think it's really harder to define, to verify this, okay, because it's
a subjective thing.
prediction. It's and the way you do this, it's this is the way I think you want, if you produce that data, I think this is the way you want to explain to the world, to say, okay, I'm doing this and this, or I'm doing like this, so you can trust me.
Yeah.
So you can trust that product, that data that I'm issuing to you, maybe.
I think that there's an important distinction, because usually when we talk about data, we're talking about discrete values that are exact. And the data world doesn't have to be that. It can also be an idea of how accurate the data is. It doesn't have to be perfectly accurate. We can show our degree of confidence in data as well. And I think that is an underutilized part of data in general, that we can say, this is how much confidence we can have in this data. We can know with fairly good certainty how uncertain we are about a data point.
Yeah.
I think in climate, where we need to move faster, knowing those uncertainties help us to navigate with enough confidence, I think.
Yeah, Philippe, I believe you underscored that on the last session about data being most valuable, or perhaps only valuable in the aggregate. And I've heard that mentioned before. Actually, I read an article by Ben Stansel. He's one of the data pundits. I'm not sure if you read his blog, but he mentioned the same thing, that data is only valuable in the aggregate. But conversely, it seems also as if data is only trustable in the aggregate by multiple observers. Especially when you're talking about collaborations across untrusted entities, such that if multiple groups or folks are observing the same thing or phenomenon, and some are not trustworthy and some are, but they come to the same conclusion, that actually makes the trustworthiness of that aggregate more trustworthy across a broad spectrum than if we had this single source of truth. It seems like we've already kind of debunked the single source of truth in the enterprise, that it's a fallacy. So maybe trust is only a thing in the aggregate, in terms of observation, in terms of data itself. Do multiple data points across a spectrum being timed, do they agree with one another?
I think also there's this, the ideas that Philippe is putting forward about knowing where we're uncertain, right? It's also actually really a useful way to convey metadata about trust to support this kind of decision-making for consumers. Because if we think about, for example, an aggregate, right, where, 10 people agree that this is true, it's very easy for us to say, well, then that must be true, because, how could they all be wrong? But there are still risks, right? It's just different vectors of possible risk. So in this case, if 10 people agree, then the risk is that all 10 are making the same mistake. And in the case of crypto, to go, back to your initial prompt, that might be happening. Like there actually might be market level, sort of misinterpretations. So if there was some way to sort of convey, this is the type of risk you're dealing with, is a, completely wrong-headed approach to the whole thing, foundational first principle kind of risk, then that helps people to think through, you know, sort of the decision-making process in interpreting that.
Mhm. It takes me, I had a short note that I made, and that was on incentives. Because a lot of trust comes also from knowing the incentives of those that are making a projection or that are putting down a data point. Because if we don't know their incentives, it will be very hard to validate if that data is good or not. Because if there's an incentive to actually give the wrong data, and we don't know it, it's likely that that data will be wrong. And also if it's very hard to verify. Whereas on the opposite side, if there are aligned incentives to give the proper data, it will be easier to trust the data. And that is seldom captured, I think, in data in general. It's just data. And that takes us to, why do we have the data? The data is usually there to tell a story. It's all about storytelling. It's what we humans have loved for 100,000 years, to listen to stories. And the data back then was crude, but we still use data in the same way. We're using the figures to tell a story. And understanding what story we're trying to tell is also something that brings trust to the data we're telling. Who is telling the story, and what are they telling, and what are they telling it with? It's a bit of a tangent to what we're talking about, but I think it's an important thing to consider.
I think it's central, because we don't think about, like, data is, you know, it's math and science, and it's, you know, it's accuracy, and it's all of these sort of really precise kinds of mental constructs. But I, you know, sort of have been able to bring a new perspective in, because I'm a storyteller who was determined to figure out this other side, you know. And what's interesting is that there's so much politicalness in the story making, and it's actually quite technical as well. It's just a different kind of technical, right? You have to understand incentives. You have to understand, you know, what someone is likely to do. You have to be able to determine risk, and, you know, and really all the things that you're talking about in the cybersecurity space are kind of construction, you know, narrative construction techniques. And so I think that where technical projects are breaking down is in fact in the lack of awareness of the broader storytelling space, whether that's the storytelling of the project itself. Why do we need to support this? Why is this useful? Or the rest of it, right? How is it, you know, who is using this, and can we trust them, and all of those other pieces that come into play.
I would separate, so I acknowledge that the storytelling exists, okay? It's sometimes, maybe most of the times, a good thing, but I would not mix good storytelling with trustworthy data. Okay, I think there is a book, I don't know about, if you lying with statistics. Okay, so I would not trust a good storyteller, not the data. Okay, because you can take good data and tell a shitty story. Okay, and you can take bad data and make it a good story. Okay, very so it's two different things in my opinion. And and if our topic is the trustworthiness of data, honestly, even if I totally agree with you that the storytelling matters, especially when you talk about all of the usage of data, but we cannot integrate the storytelling indicators, I would say, in the trustworthiness of data. Or I think I would not, at least.
I agree. I think they are two separate things, but sometimes the approach that you can take if you only look at one of them is going to be flawed, right? So for example, when the folks who are, you know, sort of dealing with data are trying to do that without understanding story, they're making decisions about how to sort things. This is where you get like AI that's producing like machine learning results that make no sense, right? And they're like, well, you know, we have a great F score, but it's okay, you know, this is obviously false. And then on the other side, you have, you know, sort of the storytellers who are using data, but not really understanding, you know, all of the complexity of producing data. And so you get the MIT analysis, which is like, well, we looked at all of the facsimiles of ESG metrics, and we've concluded that, you know, this is the analysis. And they're missing that there's actually a mountain behind that, right? So, you know, it's not that they need to be combined into a single approach, but that they need to be both sort of existing in the toolkit.
Yeah, and I think coming back to the story, I agree. There are two separate things. But the story behind why the data exists and what the story that is expected to be told with the data is important for the data itself. So if it was collected to tell a specific story, we can trust it more or less. They're not two different things, but trust is part of that story, because how we tell the story with the data will change how we perceive the data. And really good data could even get into untrusted data due to the storytelling, like you were saying, Olivier. So I think there's something between these two elements that don't really combine and shouldn't combine, but they're linked in a very important way in terms of the trustworthiness.
Yeah, what I'm convinced of is that this trustworthiness of data, it cannot be, or it has to be, it must be defined within a context. Okay, and this story you mentioned, it's like the context, which is also why you are collecting that data and why you want to use it. And it would, you can trust the data, but in a specific context. If you did not qualify your use,
I think we lost Olivier.
using your usage context of the defined. Sorry?
You're back. We lost you
okay.
for a second.
So yeah, the context is required to define the trustworthiness of data. I agree. And the story, I agree to merge this. If we say, okay, the story is the context, why you are using that data, and then it allows you to define the criteria maybe for trustworthiness within a specific context.
I really like how you put that.
Yeah, that was great. The context is key. And that ties us back into knowledge graphs and ontologies and also stakeholders, right? Because, you know, not all context needs to be in an ontology for it to be important. I also think there's a second piece too, not just the trustworthiness of the data, but also like the usability, right? Because a big portion of, you know, what we deal with is harmonization, and things need to be harmonized because they start out with this why, which maybe is too specific, right? So if the why is, you know, very narrowly defined, well, we are interested in, you know, we're NOAA, so we care about oceans only, and so we're going to focus on this kind of, you know, measurements, which is the case. I mean, I think everyone has a why that's based on their narrow mission, and that's why we're getting such narrow data, right? That also can just be a clue to help really maybe more rapidly navigate data sets. Like if you can imagine searching right now, what we have to do is look at actually download and open a data set and evaluate it by, you know, interpreting the actual data to see if it's going to be relevant to our use case. But if there was a story describing the context of why and how that data was actually collected, you know, that would save quite a bit of time for people just kind of glancing through, right? Oh, you know, that focal point is way different than where we are, so we're going to skip opening that document.
It leads me to thinking about integration, not of the data itself in terms of the pipeline, but the integration of data sources and integration into a higher order view of what is there in terms of the data. So you have, like we have specialization in healthcare and pharma, very, very narrow on very, very small subjects, where there's an enormous amount of information in that very tiny little spot. And we're dealing also on the other end with integration of all this to make it actionable, to make something out of all of those nitty-gritty points of data into something that is bigger, that is actionable, that is workable for the non-informed. And to make that integration from the nitty-gritty points into something that is useful is probably also something that is trust building done right, which is to make something out of that data, because the data in and of itself is not that helpful if it doesn't change something. If there is no, we in Changeability, the company I have, we say that if there is no change in the world, why do a project at all? That if it doesn't change anyone, we certainly didn't succeed. So how do we think about that? Because data probably will need to, in order for it to be trustworthy at large, it needs to do something. It needs to change something, probably. Maybe not for the data itself to be trusted, but for the thing that produced it, for the value of it.
there's an outcome, especially
Yeah.
in the climate case where, really at the end of the day, we're looking for management decisions. We're not looking for, knowing exactly what the precipitation is going to be in this location, other than in order to prepare for that, change when it goes below certain baselines and things like that. So, I mean, I think, and in general, I think this is where the climate climate narrative has really fallen, because it's in the arms of the scientists, and they are telling us extremely granular things that are very technical. And that's just not, can you imagine if instead of having doctors, we had researchers in the lab, saying, but you can't take Tylenol because all these things happen together. We actually need to have someone that can simplify it, right? And say, well, you have a disease and this is what you need to do. And and explain kind of those reasons for making the changes. And of course, this is based on a whole lot of other, very rigorous, very small kinds of analyses. But, at the end of the day, right, we're talking about action outcomes, which need to be different.
And this is really the validation probably of the data itself, that it becomes validated through use, through value.
Right. I mean, that's an interesting way to think about it. Imagine going back to Eric's challenge and having a marketplace for the banks themselves to say, we are using this. And I mean, I don't know that this is collaboration across an industry. That might be difficult, but they all have the same incentive, right, to sort of know what kind of data they can trust. And so they could potentially be sharing those insights as the peer-to-peer sort of, 5 stars from RBC means something versus 5 stars from the unknown person on the internet.
So what do you think of the difference in the perception of value, going back to GitHub once again, between stars and forks? And this may not make sense to everybody, but some people use forks as a better metric of value of a project than they do stars, which implies use instead of just, I heard it's great.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? If it's usable, if you are willing to use it for yourself, then, I mean, so think about, the bankers may not want to compete when they're in a company, right? But if you leave the company, you go home, you send your children to the same school that the other bankers send their children to, right? We agree that if it's good for you, it's good for me, and that's what we want. And so there's a lot of sort of, I mean, that's what societies are based on, right? If you're willing to actually do this, then you actually really do endorse it. I think that's a really interesting, how do we fork? What's the how do we translate the pattern of forking into climate?
Yeah, and seeing someone's action sometimes is better than the story, not as a counterpoint to the story part. That's important, but we've seen a transition for advertisers. It used to be that we got all our information through advertisers, and now kids are using TikTok and their peers to determine what to buy. So it's their actions and what they do versus what an advertiser tells them. So what is the corollary for data in that sense?
I think to some extent, it's actually if there is the possibility to have usage so that you can actually see that a data source, it ties back into the zero integration, zero copy integration space, which basically means you have one data source at one point that you're using throughout. So everyone uses the same source of data. And if we can show that that happens, we can show how that data permeates through through different organizations and different usages. And that means that we can have a measurable use of it. And having that as an incentive also means that the ones that are using it contribute back by showing their usage and others' usage. So it becomes interesting to use a common source instead of a non-common source. So that you can say that I'm using the data from over there. and I'm using it repeatedly, and that means that I trust it, and you can see how many others are trusting it as well. And thanks to the network effects, that means that all of those users together show that the same source is relevant.
And isn't that
Perhaps.
isn't that the basis for Google search engine? It's the number of links.
Mhm.
that are-
Yeah,
Yeah.
PageRank is showing the same picture.
Mhm.
What would be
Exactly.
interesting is if there was like, I mean, imagine a dedicated Google for companies that had this ESG reporting challenge. And they, you know, access data and they fork it maybe anonymously, you know, so it's not clear who's actually doing what, but the market, the aggregate of the market can be seen. And then regulators could sort of focus on that and say this data point, these data are wrong, right? So if they see that in one area, that news can be explained to the entire market. Because I mean, I think one of the big challenges that somebody needs to recognize and design for is that there's uncertainty in every space, right? So even the regulators don't necessarily have the expertise that they need to identify when there's a bad practice. So, you know, we almost need to be more collaborative. And Philippe, I wonder if you see this in the risk and space with cybersecurity, if we have to work together to share knowledge in these uncertain spaces.
It's a thorny subject. There is a wish, everyone wishes to collaborate, but no one wants to share the data.
Right.
In a way.
That's true.
For fear of it becoming public and taint the image. But at the same time, the cybersecurity company shares a lot of data in covert channels about what is happening. But there's only limited open data. There's the public breaches. But it's hard to estimate how much of the real breaches you have there, because that will be a very interesting statistic to be able to calculate on risk. And that is also why cybersecurity insurance is a bit hard.
So is it the concern from like the public perception of the company, or is it the competitive concern? Because it's possible to imagine like a sheltered data share where, you know, consumers don't know, but the companies themselves can collaborate if they want to.
Yeah, but considering the space, the risk of that data coming out, it becomes a very interesting prize target. So yeah,
I
so I
see.
don't know.
Right.
But I don't know. I don't know enough to be sure in there. I don't see so much of it, but it would be interesting to have it in a way. I would come back to another point that I saw there, and coming back to the PageRank, Andrew, and also how we discussed the data sources. We have these linkage system where we create trust at scale in the academic papers as well. It seems to be a common pattern in different areas where we cite the sources. And if there is a possibility to have a common view of how we express the data, so some kind of data metadata that specifies this is the uncertainty of this climate data specific. This is how we express the data. This is how we have the uncertainty. Here is how we estimated it or how we worked with it. And that there is some kind of peer review and also a source tagging system in a way. I'm using the data from here. I can see that there is provenance, lineage. We've been talking about these aspects before, where you can actually see that as part of the data itself. Then there should be possibilities to actually see the linkage and see how, in the same way as you use academic paper citing, you have an expectation in this community that you actually point to the data. And if you're not pointing to the right data, then you know that there is no real trust in it. So I think that is a mechanism that could build upon itself.
So it's almost like a website where you can publish and it's structured so that the citations are actually sort of, you know, discoverable versus the way it currently is in publication, where you actually have to find, you know, somehow produce that document yourself and then go into it and manually kind of reconstruct the path. Are you thinking like an actual like sort of website where people could publish that kind of material?
I don't know.
Okay. Oh, I think that would be great.
It's more of an idea that popped in how I see this happening some way. Probably there are some academic papers in this direction of how to build trustworthiness in data using metadata and others, but I leave that to the viewer.
Yeah, I think I see where you're going with this. It's almost as if like we have mechanisms to have this page rank phenomenon for human readable content. But you don't, at least at large, we don't have that for machine readable content, which means that we don't have a way to say, oh, this particular data set is being used by so many people. That would be something else to have that kind of, you know, the machine readable world, which I guess is what the semantic web is begging for, but we're just not there yet.
Yeah. It comes very close, and I'm thinking Creative Commons and other licensing should enable us to actually put some kind of boundary around data and these kind of licensing schemes for data, for content in different ways. And as soon as I think the entire data mesh and the graph data products become sort of a bounded box of data that you can have more or less trust in, that you can describe in different ways. So having this kind of, it contains what's on the tin of what the data is inside and how much trust you can put on it. Might be a direction.
I think that sounds great. It's almost like a modular, you know, knowledge graph off the shelf. But I don't know if that connects to what I'm thinking. So, you know, this might be a jump, but I mean, one of the things that is so broken is publication in journals. I mean, it's just absurd that we still have this process because it's, you know, it's extremely time consuming to deal with all those papers and none of it is structured. And this is, I mean, a tremendous, like, if there's a way to sort of make like a, you know, I mean, even the fact of journals being gated is a tremendous problem, right? Like there's just a lack of data that wants to be freed that's even being allowed to do that. So if there was some way to, you know, enable publications that had a certain amount of gravitas, right? It's not just a Medium blog, but it's something a little bit more invested in than that. But that was open, it was accessible, and it was structured so that all of that content could immediately be, you know, machine readable. I mean, that would be like a tremendous product as well as useful for climate.
But it would not necessarily have to be open. Of course, open would be fantastic, but the academic system has the references, and all of those references are known. If you look at OpenAlex or other database, we have all of the data that is available on which those data subjects are without having to tell what is the content of it. And using all of those references, you know which data points have been used a lot, and that is used as a proxy for validity. And thanks in one way to the academic journals saying that this is acceptable, we might have a similar system of ranking and ratings of those data sources, even if they're not publicly available. But when you use one of those, you can point to it.
I think that partially solves the problem and moves us towards machine readability and, you know, using that. But also, like in the context at NASA, for example, they are very concerned about bias and the bias that is baked into the existing citation schemas. So how do we also create open space for those articles which are not heavily cited, but that in fact are, you know, useful, right, towards moving the domain in new future directions? Because I think in many domains what we have is like sort of a crystallization of one way of doing things, but there's maybe many other types of ways that could be viable if it was easier to get published and things like that. So I mean, I think that probably this is a problem for for another conversation.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, it looks like we're 7 minutes past our time. I'm happy to go on for a few more minutes, but just want to remind you that we've taken our hour.
It's a great chat. I think we've solved a lot of problems.
I enjoyed listening to it.
What's that, Andrew?
I enjoy listening to it. Sometimes I find I just need to stop talking and listen. And this was a good one for that. This is an area where I didn't have much to contribute, but definitely enjoyed the conversation.
Me too.
too.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of trust. We could probably talk more. There's so many pieces of it, right? It's like
Mhm.
trust of data is just one aspect.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for today.
Yeah. Thanks so much, guys.
All right.